Good evening, everyone, and welcome. Hello, my name is R.L. Rowsey. I am the Sun Valley Summer Symphony Education Artistic Director, and on behalf of all of our folks here at the Symphony, welcome and thanks for being under the tent with us tonight to get ready for another great evening at the Pavilion. How many of you were here last night? Isn't it cool? That's the guy right there that conducted the first piece, you know.
Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you.
That's why Sameer wasn't here last night to do the launch at, because he was conducting the first number. Peter Henderson still had to run around with his tux on and jump onto the piano, but I don't know, we do it all here. Can I do a shameless plug for a couple of things that are coming up in the next couple of days? Tomorrow, though, in your program book, it looks a little bit like it's quiet here. No, I guess not. It's all there. There are two concerts in the Pavilion tomorrow featuring our students from the Summer Music Institute. Yeah. Thank you, thank you, thank you. We have about 290 students who are studying with us right now. 40 of them are an advanced group that have been studying for 2 weeks. The other are an intermediate and beginner groups. And many of them get a chance to perform in the Pavilion during these two concerts tomorrow. And Sameer will be conducting our advanced chamber orchestra on the evening concert. Consider popping by for one of those. If you don't have time to stay for the whole thing, stop by and listen. I think you will be proud of the work that your symphony does to support students, because the work goes on all year long, but our Summer Music Institute is profound. We have kids that are just worn out now from working so hard. They have great desires to create great music. So pop by. On Saturday, at the community campus, at the community school, at 11 o'clock, there's a performance of opera workshop scenes and piano ensembles. And you may want to pop by and check that. Those are from our advanced students, our encounter students. And then at 4 o'clock, even though your program book says 3 o'clock, at 4 o'clock at St. Thomas, our chamber ensembles of strings and piano students will be performing at St. Thomas. So if you have a chance to pop out and give a shout out to our students, boy, we'd love that. We are proud of the work they've been doing. So now that I've done all the shameless plugs, oh, and then tomorrow night, Saturday night, our chamber ensemble, conducted again by Sameer, will play in a side-by-side concert with the symphony players. So our students sitting next to the musicians in the symphony to do the opening piece on our family concert. It's a powerful weekend.
And what else is happening? What else are you? What are you doing?
Oh, and I get to narrate "Behold the Bold Umbrelephant" at the end of the concert. That's why I have this here. I have homework to do tonight. Well, that's enough. Let me introduce to you our associate conductor and one of the coolest guys I know, Sameer Patel.
Thank you. I can't believe you almost forgot that last part.
Yeah.
R.L.
Well, I was trying to be a little bit, I don't know.
A little bit humble and.
Right.
Well, you know that last piece, "Behold the Bold Umbrelephant," it was commissioned by my home orchestra. I'm the associate conductor of the San Diego Symphony, and it was commissioned by the orchestra and recorded by the orchestra. And it's based off of Jack Prelutsky, the children's poet. And he wrote a set of imaginary poems about imaginary animals. So you have trumpet twos and two baboons and solitary spatchaloon and all sorts of fun little titles like that. And so it'll be a lot of fun to share the stage with R.L. And just to echo what he said about our students, they're fantastic. You know, I am so proud of them and all the hard work they're doing. These are students that are, as he just said, completely exhausted from this wonderful experience that they've been having, but they're also, you know, they showed up this morning, some of them at 7:30 before our 9 a.m. rehearsal just to put in the extra time, you know. And I came in at 8:30 and I said, "Good morning, guys." And they were like, "Yeah, we've been here since 7:30 working together." And, you know, so I'm so proud of their transformation that they've made, not only over the past 2 weeks, but just since last year, because many of them are returning. So it's a lot of fun, and they're doing great work. So, but tonight we have a special journey with these two pieces that we'll be performing. The first is Rimsky-Korsakov's Capriccio Espagnol, and the second piece that we'll be doing is Sibelius 5, Fifth Symphony. It's a piece that's very near and dear to my heart. But I thought I'd start first of all with Rimsky-Korsakov, because he was a Russian composer, and he was actually self-taught. He was born in 1844 and died in 1908, which is always surprising to me. I always thought he was like this guy that lived only in the 1800s, but he had such a profound impact on a lot of Russian composers at the time. And he was, like I just said, self-taught. He came from a military family, and he was a midshipman. And so he spent a lot of time on a boat all around the world. And he went back to Russia, and he decided that he wanted to start studying composition. Officially, but he had run in certain a circle of Russian composers called the Five, the Mighty Five. These were Glinka and Balakirev and Cesar Cui and Modest Mussorgsky and Rimsky-Korsakov, and they were all trying to create this national identity. When we talk about what is American music, one might say, oh, that's Copland and Gershwin and the Great American Soundbook and jazz, right? And Broadway. And when we say what is French music, you could say it's all the way from Ravel and Debussy to the French chanson. And Spanish music, what is that? But Rimsky-Korsakov was one of these guys that was looking at Russian folk tales, Russian stories, and the unique Russian sounds of the villages, and he would transcribe some of the songs that Glinka would go and say these are what we're hearing in these villages, and Rimsky-Korsakov would transfer them into orchestrations and arrangements. But that says nothing about the piece that we're going to hear, because it's called Capriccio Espagnol. It's a Spanish capriccio. It has nothing to do with Russian music. But one of Rimsky-Korsakov's hallmarks was that he was an incredible orchestrator. He wrote a book on orchestration. He wrote one of the most famous pieces of music, Scheherazade, which is based off of the Arabian Nights. And he was a master at orchestration. In fact, one of his students was the composer Respighi, who wrote The Pines of Rome, The Fountains of Rome. You might know that from Walt Disney's Fantasia. But Rimsky-Korsakov was at his best when he was writing a grand spectacle on stage, and that's certainly what we're going to hear tonight. It's a piece, like I said, called Capriccio Espagnol. It's essentially a fantasy on Spanish themes and dances, and I thought I'd just play a little bit of this first move, which is an alborada, a Spanish dance. Clarinet and the strings, listen. They're plucking. Plucked strings like a guitar. You hear that? Chicka chicka cha, chicka 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 cha. So he's really trying to go after the color of Spain, the sights and the smells and the sounds of Spain, and you hear that again in the second movement. Here's a little bit of this. This is a Spanish dance called the seguidilla. And I'll play a little bit of the fourth movement, because the same alborada that we heard comes back as a third movement, but this is the fourth movement. It's pretty Spanish sounding, right? Ali, maybe just a little bit lower in volume. Ali, maybe just turn it down a little more. Down. Now listen to this. in this movement, you just heard that big violin solo. It's called a cadenza, and it's a moment for a solo instrument to share its unique voice and its sound. And we have 4 cadenzas in this introduction. 5 if you include that brass fanfare that you hear. We also hear, in addition to the violin, we hear from the clarinet, we hear from the flute, we hear from the harp. All who just kind of show off the capabilities of their instrument. And like I said, Rimsky-Korsakov was one of these composers that knew every instrument backwards and forwards. And so you certainly get the sense that he knew what he was doing. And this is how it ends. This is called a fandango. So it's always a unique thing for me when people talk about what is Spanish music, right? Because I think if we were to say that the composer of this piece was Manuel de Falla, one of the great Spanish composers, nobody would be surprised. But when we say his name was Nikolai Rimsky-Korsakov and he was from Russia, it's a different story, isn't it? But somehow he was able to find this Spanish color, the Spanish flair, these Spanish stories and combine it all together into this extraordinary piece. This music, if you ask me, is about the orchestra itself. It's a showpiece, and its sole purpose is to get your blood pumping, and it will. And it pairs nicely with the Sibelius, because you're going to need that. The world of Sibelius is slower. It's colder, it's harsher, it's more north. Sibelius considered himself an apparition from the woods. He was very much isolated at the time when he wrote this symphony. He lived a very long life. We don't think of it, but Sibelius lived from 1865 to 1957. And for many of us, we think, my gosh, I thought Sibelius lived in the 1800s. You know, same thing like I said earlier about Rimsky-Korsakov, that they were writing at the same time. Well, they were. It's just how it so happens that Sibelius lived another 50 years and lived till past World War II. But it's an interesting story with Sibelius because he came from a Swedish background. And for those of you that know your Finnish history know that it's rather a young nation in many ways. It was once part of Sweden, then it was once part of Russia. And only in the late 1800s did there start to blossom this kind of nationalistic, patriotic moment in Finland, where people started deciding that they wanted to be independent. And there was no greater spokesperson for this movement than Jean Sibelius. I think in so many ways it was almost accidental. I don't know how intentional it was supposed to be. I don't know how intentional it was that Sibelius was to be the face for this movement. But many of you know his Second Symphony, which when it was performed, which is a glorious piece of music, that when it was performed, it was a huge, massive success and cemented his fame. And around the same time, he also wrote a work called Finlandia, which is a beautiful, short, 8-minute piece for orchestra. I think it's 8 minutes, around there. And this piece was given its title Finlandia, and of course it became this sort of Finnish, if you will, de facto national anthem at the time. Before Finland joined the European Union, Sibelius's face was on the 100-crown note. He was featured on a stamp for many years. He is, in so many ways, still a national hero in Finland. I've had the great privilege of going to Finland 3 times, and you see his presence everywhere still to this day. And when Sibelius was young, he had no greater ambition than to be a concert violinist. And he hoped, and he hoped, and he hoped, and he practiced, and he practiced, and he practiced, and he was just never quite good enough. Instead, he found his calling as a composer. And he went to all the European centers. He went to Paris, he went to Vienna, he went to Berlin. He studied there, he studied with Busoni, he studied in Finland. And he eventually, upon writing these pieces, like I said, found some sense of fame. But fame became very dangerous for Sibelius because with fame came money, and with money came an abundance of alcohol and tobacco and a gluttonous lifestyle. He was known to eat to go out to restaurants and consume large amounts of vodka and lobster, for instance. But like I said, he had a very special place in music. But for those of you that know the history of the first 2 decades of the 1900s, know that as soon as World War I came, that shattered everybody and everything. And certainly it also shattered music history. Because prior to World War I, Sibelius was riding high. And he was in the United States. He received an honorary doctorate from Yale. At one point, Sibelius was the most performed living composer, especially in the United States. Everybody knew the music of Jean Sibelius. Thanks to conductors like Stokowski and Ormandy and Koussevitzky, he was getting performed left and right. In fact, there are stories of Koussevitzky sending these letters, bordering angry letters, demanding from Sibelius, why have you still not written your 8th symphony? He was working on it until one day out of nowhere he decided to burn it. This is the composer I love more than perhaps any composer out there, because his world was full of doubt, and it was full of certainty, but it was also full of doubt. You know, so before the war, like I said, he was riding high, and on his way back to Finland in 1914, he heard the news of war. And all of a sudden, he moved back to Helsinki, and he was no longer able to have his music published by his German publisher. He was now confined to staying in Finland instead of having this cosmopolitan presence. He was writing music alone in the woods in his beautiful home in Ainola, which is outside of Helsinki, and it's this beautiful house on the lake. And he would just sit there and write music in silence. And while he was still popular in Finland, people were no longer talking about Sibelius on the main continent of Europe, in the European centers. And that crisis is where the music that we're going to hear comes from. And it's an extremely powerful piece. It starts in a way that, well, you know, we all have images in our mind when it comes to music, but I grew up in Michigan. I grew up in a cold climate on Lake Huron. And for me, when I hear this opening, I think of the frozen landscape of waking up in the morning on sunrise, and there's nothing but ice outside on Lake Huron. This is where I come from. And if I can find where I put it.
Why wouldn't he get published during the war? Was he a Jewish?
No, it was essentially just because he, you know, the war. You know, I mean, it was just it was politics. It was all these things.
When you say he was no longer on the world stage, was he United at that time?
I'm sure in Germany, I mean, traveling was hard, right? I mean, it was impossible to travel at that time, and so he wasn't. You know, in Germany, music was still being performed. In Britain, music was still being performed, but people weren't talking about Sibelius. And more than that, after the war, all semblance of the past was shattered. Artists and musicians and composers were all trying to create a new sound and a new reality based off of the horrors they lived through in World War I. I mean, you know the story. Millions and millions of people died for the very first time. And people started asking, well, what is this life that we're living? And so they were all trying to deal with reality and trying to deal with the world they live in. So this is how it starts. The music has a searching quality to it. He wrote in his diary in April 1915, "It's warm outside and the winter is receding. Once again there is a fragrance in the air of the thaw, of youth, and of crime. In the evening I worked on the symphony, arrangement of the themes. This important task, which fascinates me in a mysterious way, It's as if God the Father had thrown down the tiles of a mosaic from heaven's floor and asked me to determine what kind of picture it was. Maybe this is a good definition of composing. Maybe not. How would I know? This is Sibelius for you. He calls for an inner logic in his music. He says that no longer is the recipe of sonata allegro form that we discovered in the Mozart concerts, no longer is this recipe important, or no longer does it say anything to me. The notes I write have an inner logic, and they have to find their own way in the music. So what that means is, as we listen to this piece tonight, patience is not only a key, but a virtue. You'll hear that silence becomes a motive. You'll hear that noise becomes a motive. You'll hear that your own inner psychology becomes a motive. You are waiting and waiting and waiting and waiting for something to happen. And that anxiety is so worth it when you get to those big moments. And I know we have to stop here, but I just want to play for you a moment of the third movement. This is not a melody. This is, what is this? It's just buzzing away. It's electricity, it's an electrical current. It's a rhythm. Everything in the whole piece leads to this moment you're about to hear. And he said that when he came to this moment, he looked outside and there were 16 swans that had taken flight over his home. This is called the famous swan theme. This is the big arrival moment. You feel like you're about to soar. Isn't this something? Exactly. These are the wings of a bird, if you can imagine. Okay, let's not give it all away. But anyway, so this is Sibelius. Like I said, patience is a key. And you have to, it's a lot, you know, while the Rimsky-Korsakov is a sprint, Sibelius 5 is a marathon. And there will be times where you'll wonder, where am I going? Where am I right now? What's going on? And I tell you, just be patient, because when you get through it, it is the most extraordinary music and I'm so excited for all of you that you get to experience it tonight. So, thank you.